So let's look at this just real quick. So his problem is you've broken off Eucharistic communion, and yet you do not consider that you've caused a schism, or that we stand outside the church. So for him, this is impossible. But in fact, if you look at Canon 15, you'll see that that's exactly what has been created through Canon 15. And let's do that. This is held in 861 under St. Photius in the Church of the Apostles. It's before the 8th Ecumenical Council. This is Canon 15 of this so-called First Second Council, is what it was called later on. And it's a large gathering with the papal legates from the West, and they're ruling on they're issuing canons. There's actually 3 canons that are related here to the whole situation, because they had certain phenomena at the time, a lot of confusion, a lot of breaking of commemoration and communion of their bishops and patriarchs, and there was a lot of chaos. And they after the iconoclast 100 years of iconoclasm, of course, there was a lot of chaos, and so they have canons that are condemning those priests or bishops who, for non-dogmatic, questions that do not pertain to the faith, ceased commemoration of their bishops and broke off. They condemn those instances. And then they have Canon 15. It says the following, which is trying to say, well, yes, but we do have this case where breaking communion or ceasing commemoration is not condemnable. Actually, it's praiseworthy. When is that? That's really important. And why? Why is that something that's praiseworthy? And then if you understand the thinking of the fathers here, you're going to understand why Metropolitan Cyril's stance, which essentially is the basis for the church going underground, not continuing under Sergius, and we got to understand why. On what basis can he have that stance? Because that's the stance that then justifies so much more going forward. And so we have to go into the mind of the fathers here in the canon and try to understand why Sergius is wrong. Sergius is saying here there are things that are incompatible according to his mind. You don't call it schismatics. You don't say we're without grace. You see how he thinks very legalistically, just externally. And so there's no grounds for your schism, and yet you have no communion with us, and you don't consider us outside the church. So how does that work? Well, let's look at Canon 15 and see how that works. Now, I'm going to read the whole thing quickly because we have a lot to cover, so stay with me. The rules laid down with reference to presbyters and bishops and metropolitans are still more applicable to patriarchs. So that in case any presbyter or bishop or metropolitan dares to succeed or apostatize from the communion of his own patriarch, this is very important. There are brothers here who are justifying their stance against the entire Orthodox Church, saying that we need to break communion with everybody and anyone across the board, all around the world, whether they're my bishop or not. But this canon doesn't talk about anybody but his own bishop, his own patriarch, and fails to mention the latter's name in accordance with custom duly fixed and ordained in the divine mystagogy. But before a conciliar verdict has been pronounced and has passed judgment against him, creates a schism. All right, so let me say that again. In case any presbyter, bishop, metropolitan succeeds or apostatizes from his own patriarch and does not commemorate him, and before a conciliar verdict, before a council has happened, he pronounces judgment against him, he creates a schism. All right, so this is what Canon 15, this is the canon that many who have ceased commemoration and gone and break communion and set up parallel jurisdictions, such as the old calendars groups. This is the canon they cite. In fact, the first part of the canon condemns one who before a council does this. Now we'll look at the second part, which needs some explanation, the exception to this. But this is the basis. This is the basic. We're going, first of all, we're stating the basis, and then we're saying the exception. All right. So the basis is before a conciliar verdict, you pass judgment, you break, you cease, you're creating a schism. The Holy Synod has decreed that this person shall be held an alien to every priestly function. In other words, he's going to be suspended. If only he be convicted of having committed this transgression of the law. Accordingly, these rules have been sealed and ordained as respecting persons who, under the pretext of charges against their own president, stand aloof and create a schism and disrupt the union of the church. So they don't say what charges, just charges against their president. But the canon says, as for those persons, on the other hand, who on account of some heresy condemned by the holy synods or fathers, withdrawing themselves from communion with their president, who, that is to say, is preaching heresy publicly and teaching it bareheaded in church, such persons not only are not subject to any canonical penalty on account of their having walled themselves off from any and all communion with the one called a bishop before any conciliar or synodical verdict has been rendered, but on the contrary, they shall be deemed worthy to enjoy the honor which befits them among Orthodox Christians. So what's the exception? That because of a heresy already condemned by synods and fathers, withdrawing themselves from communion with their president, who, that is to say, is preaching the heresy publicly and teaching it bareheaded in church. So he's totally unapologetic and intransient in his heresy. It's not somebody who's confused. It's not somebody who's just saying it privately. Publicly, he's doing it, and he's pushing it on the people. That's got to be happening. Of his own bishop, again, a heresy that's already been condemned by holy fathers or synods. And this person will be praised. He's due to honor among Orthodox Christians, even before any conciliar or synodical verdict has been rendered. So that's the exception. It has to be a declared heresy condemned by the synods and the fathers. For they have not defied, it says, they have defied not bishops, but pseudo-bishops and pseudo-teachers, and they have not sundered the union of the church with any schism, but on the contrary have been seduous to rescue the church from schisms and divisions. But two things need to be stated again and really stressed. It's clear here that the aim is not that we simply cease commemoration, cease communion, and move on. That the whole point of this canon is that they lead to a conciliar verdict. That's clearly what is important here. Conciliar verdicts are the basis for the stance. There's been a conciliar verdict in the past condemning a heresy. And it's obviously that's where it's going to lead, right? So it happens before, but it's commemorated here before any conciliar or synodical verdict. So there will be a conciliar or synodical verdict. That has to happen. That's how the church works. We're conciliar. And so it's going to lead there. That's the point of the stance being praised, that it will lead to this. And therefore, there will be peace in the church because there will be a decision that cannot be gainsaid if it's, of course, following the Orthodox faith, on the basis of the Orthodox faith. So those who, again, cease commemoration and communion with their own bishop, who's teaching heresy publicly and pushing it, that's already been condemned, and that person is doing it for the sake of the unity of the church, which means it's going to lead to a conciliar decision. That's the aim. It's not an end in itself. It's not just, obviously, that would be total Protestantism, right? If we just said everybody can break communion left and right, and it doesn't matter if there's ever a council. No, we want a council. The new martyrs are constantly calling for a council. That's how the things are solved. And so that's two words on the canon. Now, going back to Bishop Sergius, why is his analysis incorrect? Why can't he figure it out? So he doesn't have in mind this canon, or if he has it in mind, he's not interpreting it properly. He would say, well, this is what I'm doing. He's clearly not recognizing as a heresy or as a delusion, a teaching that's been condemned by the fathers. And on one level, he's right, because every time there's a new incarnation of a delusional stance, it's new. So it needs a conciliar decision. This will need a conciliar decision as well, as we said. But the stance of saying we're going to separate from you, not condemn you, because we're not the council to condemn you and say you are a heretic. But we're going to separate from you to protect the church from your delusion, and this is in fact, in those days, this was the only real weapon they had. They couldn't do much more because of the communists. So they were breaking off communion precisely to do whatever they can to bring an end to the innovation and the delusion the usurpation of power and the distortion of the ecclesiology of the church. And yet they're not passing judgment. They're not saying that you're outside the church. They're not saying that there is created a schism. They're saying this needs to come to a council and needs to be solved. I think it's totally in the spirit of the canon. That's the narrow path that the canon sets out. It's not an end in itself. Which Metropolitan Cyril is in the right and is following the spirit of the canon because he's aiming toward a conciliar decision. He's aiming toward a solution in council ultimately, and he's not pronouncing a judgment as if he's the council and the infallible voice of the church. And this is the balance one has to keep if one is going to walk that path, which is a very difficult path. Notice it doesn't say must cease the president, communion with the president. If, as for those, he says, who withdraw themselves from such a heretical teacher, they're deemed worthy of honor, it says. It doesn't say they must do it anywhere in this canon. It doesn't say if they don't, there's going to be punishment. In most canons, if you don't do something, there's a punishment at the end. It simply praises them and protects them from synodical condemnation. It says this person shall not be condemned, it should be honored. And of course, the solution to that now rift between the cleric or the bishop or the patriarch is going to have to come through a council. So that's the spirit of the church and the canons. That's why St. Cyril's in the right, and he's not in the right, Metropolitan Sergius, because his stance is papal-like. His stance is, I will decide, and you are, instead of saying we have a rift now between us, let's come together as a church in council and solve this. None of that. There's none of that from Metropolitan Sergius. And if people are doing it today in the same way, if there are local churches or groups of Orthodox who are doing the same thing, saying you are a heretic, you are deluded, you are condemned, and they just get up and walk away, even if it's a local church, because a local church should not be satisfied, if it's a question of the faith, should be satisfied with its own decision, but should bring it to the larger church, and there should ultimately be an ecumenical council. So there should never be this complacency. We have condemned, we have ruled, we have defrocked, it's over. That's not a responsible position. It's a papal-like decision, especially coming from only one bishop, of course, and a tiny portion of the hierarchy of the church in Russia. So hopefully I've explained why he misses it. He might be correct legally, but he misses the whole spirit of the canon. I think that's why. I think going forward, you're going to see why St. Cyril's in the spirit of this canon. Now, some people get hung up, and this is a point of debate about, well, it has something like ecumenism already been condemned in council? Not as such, not as this particular incarnation of this delusion. It's never been condemned in council. That is the distortion of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, the distortion of our understanding of the body of Christ, the blasphemy of claiming there's two churches that are, or there's a church that's filled with heresy, or there's a partial church, all these kind of theories that we have, two lungs, the same body theories, all these heretical theories that are we're trying to pass off as Orthodox. These things are new. Does that mean that we don't know if they're heresy or not? Of course we know they're heresy. The church always knew, even before Arius ever preached, they knew that Arius' position was a heretical position. They needed to come in council and condemn it, though. And they actually happened many times, not just once. So if we had the idea that, well, it's already been condemned, we don't need to go to a council, we don't need a council to decide, you would not have the war and the battle and council after local council and second ecumenical council again coming back and essentially condemning the same heretical stances. And that's why the church didn't see the council in a legalistic manner, but as a need for particular people in a particular time and place to affirm the faith and draw the boundaries for the sake of the faithful. That's what the decisions of the councils are, boundaries. We need a council and the boundaries and discernment of those boundaries from a to put an end to the particular revealing or particular version of this delusion. There may have been other versions of this in church history. I don't remember anything so clearly against the ecclesiology of the church in church history as today. There, of course, have been many challenges to the ecclesiology. We can go back and we can see in the 17th, 18th century and things like that. But in this particular, so the question of it being a condemned by holy sinners and fathers, well, yes and no. It was condemned essentially, but not particularly in time and place. And we need to do that. We need to come back and do that. It's essential if we're going to fight the delusion. So the same thing with, on the one hand, the person who today sees commemoration for ecumenism or Sergianism is right in opposing the heresy, but it's not been yet condemned. So it's both and. Both we need to have people stand up and say, no, this is delusional if their bishop is preaching it. And yet that should not be an end in itself, as if it's already been decided by other fathers and figures in the past, because it's a new version, a new a new manifestation, which is unprecedented, and it needs to be condemned in particular in our day and age. So anyway, we can't get too much deeper. It's a very deep subject, the question of Canon 15. But I think that what we need to walk away with is that the spirit and the goal of St. Cyril, which was a conciliar solution, which was not a schismatic approach, not a legalistic approach, is what Metropolitan Sergius doesn't get and misses. And he remains baffled by St. Cyril's position because he's looking at things in a legalistic, superficial manner.